Well, welcome back to the second panel today. This is the last one. Now, one of the challenges of trying to develop a program like this, content-wise, was we had to do it before election results were in. So it turns out that the title of our panel, I'm going to adjust a bit for reasons I'll explain, but it'll still be an analysis of the election, and particularly in terms of voter identity and behavior and what shifted where and with what results and with what implications. So I'm joined in this discussion, and I'll give very brief intros because their stellar lives and careers are in the program, and you'll know all of my sisters who seem to be up at the table here together. So Elise Jordan, who is, and maybe some of you have seen her on television as well, because she is a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC, and also a contributor to Time Magazine. Next to her is Kiki, Kiki McLean, a public affairs and political strategist, veteran of many campaigns, many struggles and battles along the way, and also treasurer of the Democratic National Governors Association, the Dems. Okay, next to her, Bettina Inclan, a top Republican strategist, and also a former director in the Republican National Committee for Hispanic Outreach. And bringing up the end, but not least, is Kimberly Johnson, who is here at Rothermer as a Winant, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a Winant visiting professor of American government at Rothermer. Also happens to be an NYU professor from our Wagner School of Public Service. So I don't know how she snuck on the panel. We said, yes, come, would be great. So it's a good group. So the struggles of the title for this panel comes from the fact that when we were putting the panels together, the polls and their content, the pollsters were showing these very yawning gaps, well, smaller, narrowing, and then yawning gaps in the American electorate. They were picking up what they thought were different groups seemed to be pulling in very strong opposite directions. So we heard a lot about the gender gap, the age gap, the racial gap. And I think the question we're left with now is, it wasn't that gappy. And so I think probably one way to start the conversation would be both to broaden it out a bit of, as you look at the results of the week after the election, I asked my panelists, what dynamics of voter identity and behavior do you think were at work? What had changed from 20? What had changed from expectations? Where did the pollsters get it right or wrong? But what was going on in the dynamics of the race? I'm going to ask to start with Kimberly, because she's done studies in 3 states, right, Kimberly? Mm-hmm. You said Michigan, California, and New York. And New York. Very granular of what was going on in those 3 states. And I thought we can broaden it out, but it'd be interesting to get a faculty member and someone who's done research on this already, of what was going on in those 3 states, one of which is a swing state, the other 2 not swung at all, too much, except blah, blah. So go ahead, Kimberly.
Great. So I'm just going to read one little historical point, which is going to start with a quote, somewhat quote, of Tip O'Neill, who famously said, all politics is local. And so what I'm going to argue or try to sort of think about is we have these 3 big issues, right? Immigration, inflation, and maybe identity as kind of the 3 motivating factors for explaining this election. But what I want to think about is how these 3 issues really get translated on the local level. And that if I'm a voter, I'm really thinking about immigration through what I'm seeing and what I'm feeling and experiencing at that local level. Same with inflation and same with identity. And so what I thought was really interesting to sort of very early on, thinking about these gaps and thinking about how these parties are kind of reconstituting themselves in terms of their different factions, is first, I thought was very interesting looking at Michigan, and particularly thinking about at least last fall, but winter, thinking about Israel, Gaza, and that just sort of issue that I think has just fundamentally, I think, fractured a big part of the Democratic coalition. And I think that's something that we haven't spoken about, but I think that definitely is something to contemplate as we go forward. So I'm thinking about Michigan, and I see this couple interesting clips where pro-Palestinian folks are going and protesting at Wayne County Democratic events. In particular, they went to the Christmas party. And so there's all these, elders of the Black community celebrating their Christmas party. This is a big deal. And protesters go into the event and they start shouting and screaming. And there's actually scuffling between these young protesters and people, quite frankly, with keys. And I thought that actually cannot be good. This is not a good thing. And so I think in many ways, Israel Gaza hasn't come up, but I think in terms of thinking about people feeling disaffection or distance from the party, I think that certainly that issue, I think, was one in which you see this kind of weakening of enthusiasm for the Democrats. People who support Israel thought the Democrats were doing enough. People who were pro-Gaza felt like the Democrats were doing enough. In fact, they called him Genocide Joe. And I think that that enthusiasm gap really came from this really early moment where the Democratic Party just couldn't figure out a way, and still can't really figure out a way to address these two very different and very vocal factions of its coalition. So that's one. The second thing is more like a San Francisco, Oakland, or Bay Area, New York City thing, which is thinking about immigration. I think it was diabolical but brilliant of DeSantis and Abbott to send the immigrants to these northern cities. Why? Because I think in many ways it forced the sort of local Democrats who sort of said, oh, we're a sanctuary city, with the reality of, oh, suddenly you have lots of these immigrants that you have to grapple with. You have to fit your reality of how do you sort of feed and clothe and get settled lots of people in a moment where you're actually facing a lot of local fiscal constraints. And so the rhetoric of we're a sanctuary city and we've always welcomed immigrants is really hitting hard against the reality of what the immigrants were there for. And then I think thinking about the people who are already living there, right? So hearing reports of working class African-American neighborhoods who are saying, hey, wait a minute, suddenly all these people, and and again, like the numbers are whatever the numbers are, but I think the perception was that a new groups of people have come in, they're suddenly getting attention and funding from local government, what we're not getting. Suddenly they've sort of jumped to the front of the line. So I think there's an issue of fairness around immigration about suddenly there are these immigrants who jump to the front of the line. And I think that's something that both say moderates as well as folks who live in cities and people of color who live in cities could really sort of get behind the idea of immigration as being not fair. Secondly, I think the issue around urban disorder. I think that one of the things that comes out of George Floyd is, I think, a real move to think about how do we rethink policing, how do we rethink the uses of public space. In San Francisco, ideas about harm reduction. All these are really great policies. These are really great ideas. But I think in practice, it led to a perception that these public spaces were not spaces in which, whether you're suburbanite or not, you didn't feel comfortable going into that. In fact, it's seen as a danger. So I think in many ways, thinking about immigration and identity and inflation really, I think, was really felt in many different ways by the people who lived in these places. So I think, yes, these were big issues, but I think at the day-to-day level, people saw these incidents, these circumstances, and really sort of said, no, we really don't think the Democrats are doing a good job.
Kimberly, let me ask you this, particularly in San Francisco. Do you think some of this was related to the incumbent mayor not winning her reelection, isn't it? Wasn't
Right,
London
so actually
Breed?
that's a good point. to
London
bring up.
Breed, and it was the mayor of San Francisco. And she was trying, it would appear, to get at some of those issues of safety and the migrant issues, but she was defeated.
Right. I mean, I
in the
think there's a
election.
number, I mean,
Incumbent
cases to put in, and a number of these sort of progressive Ds.
in San
in
Francisco.
San Francisco were,
Yeah.
and even members of the squad lost their elections before this. So I think there really was already kind of a local backlash to a sense that the Democrats, the progressive Democrats, had gone a little bit too far.
So Kiki, let me turn to you. Thank you. And I think that for your theory of the case, I know you always have a theory of the case, but in terms of
Not a conspiracy.
not a conspiracy of the case, but this idea of, am I downplaying the idea of gaps? It does seem a lot of them seem to at least narrow or dissipate. Although I would like to return later to one that was mentioned later in this panel, to one that was mentioned in the previous panel, close to my heart, which is the college degree gap, non-college. So we'll return to that later. But a lot of those other gaps seem to dissipate, and it seemed to be more a question of swinging at the margins. But what do you think were some of the dynamics at work on the voter, either identity or behavior, or interestingly, how does identity affect behavior?
Well, let's start with some basics. The gap is real and
Okay.
they're still big. Okay, they were narrowed some, and that's something we've got to pay a little bit of attention to. Interestingly, and I'll defer to our numbers expert here and our top analyst, but the concept of geography was less invasive in expanding the gaps. I don't know if it played a role in closing the gaps, right? So you'll recall they talked about the 7 states in two realms, the blue wall and then the south and the west, southwest, I should say, of Arizona. So it's interesting to separate that out for a minute. The second thing that I think is important that not being discussed a lot is voter turnout was not what it was expected to be.
Lower.
This was not now, historically, we're still on a trend up in the long arc of voter performance. But the amount of work that went into registering new voters, shoring up old voters, developing GOTV plans, we performed no better than the last cycle, which would have indicated we would have been much larger. So perhaps some of the prognostications about where the gap was going was diminished by the lack of voter turnout, because I think Democrats would say, when I look at the first numbers, it's our folks, the people we expected that we registered to show, didn't show. And by the way, to all the young people and the students here who are highly engaged, highly responsible, yet again, you have not shown up. Okay. So let me just be
And
very
yet we still
clear about that.
invited you to this conference.
So I don't want to hear my kids, one of whom is in college and one of whom is newly out of college, talk to me about how important their vote is and why aren't they having more attention paid to them. Never have young people been paid more attention to by campaigns, the amount of work that the communications department has moved to creators and to other methods of communication. So it's not that nobody showed up, but you didn't show up in the way you were expected to show up. And that is a repeat performance and something that's steady.
And elected officials pay attention to that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, one of the biggest gap closers or switches, maybe we'd say, was the performance of 19 to 29-year-olds, right? But that's kind of a big number to me. If I'm working on strategy on a campaign, I don't equate the 19-year-old voting experience as the same as a 29-year-old voting experience. If it's a young woman, I'm a lot more concerned about, is she married? Does she have a child? Did she go to college when I'm crunching numbers? So I want you to think about those things as you see those numbers come through. So as a reminder, voter performance overall was not what we expected it to be. There was great emphasis on really turning the corner on the youth vote. That's not there. The women's vote, right, which one would have assumed by abortion, these were the predictions would have carried the day. But Jody and others rightly point out, women carried those abortion referendums in most of well, I'm going to say all of them because Florida carried them to the day, right? So what does that tell us at the end of the day? It tells us that there is a different decision-making hierarchy in the mind of voters right now. I don't think this is a case of does that issue win over that issue. It's clear from my perspective, that people chose to gamble again on someone whose public performance and demeanor, to me, demeans the office in our country. That's my bias when I do the analysis. They made other choices that historically, as Americans, we have not made. I, as an analyst, completely understand why people voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Intellectually, from all the conversations I have with my colleagues, I will get to where I understand it in 2024, but I don't. And why I don't get it now is because I don't understand the hierarchy of decision-making by voters right now.
A humility, and part of it, and you heard it in the first panel, this isn't even a first draft of history, right? It's these
We're in it still.
It's the
We're still counting votes.
we're
still counting votes.
We're still counting votes. We don't know. So it was brave of us to do this, I suppose, just a week after the election. But it comes with this huge asterisk of, everything is still settling. We don't even have the final results in from California. So take it all. I think though what Kiki brought up and what Kimberly did, and even in the previous panels, but these are things to be thinking about as we get the numbers in and refine them. What were some of these dynamics at work? Bettina, as I say, at the end of the day, and I think Kiki made a good transition there in terms of talking about there was a gap, but there were other factors as well, which was low turnout. And the Democrats had really expected a high turnout, I think, in some of their analysis. But Bettina, another way of looking at it is Trump in the end not only held tight to his core base, but made, in some cases slightly, but in others significantly expanded his coalition and chipped away at what was a traditional Democratic coalition. And of course, figuring in that a significant share of Black and Hispanic voters, particularly men, but Hispanic Latino voters. So from your point of view, as someone who's watched this group, and in fact, I can remember you were on record in previous conferences saying, don't take this group for granted as an immediate part of the Democratic coalition. So if you come to enough of these, you get to be proven right. But from your perspective in that spot, what did you see going on in that community?
I think the biggest thing is demography is not destiny. Like your race, the color of your skin does not dictate my politics. My brain does. And what the Republican Party and Trump was able to do is something they built on for a long time of reaching out to voters. But I think uniquely that Trump is a once in a generation candidate. He did something that traditional, I've worked for a long time in the Republican Party, that the Republican institution would have not done. That he went to groups and he went to communities that most of the time people said, don't waste your money. And he's like, he is so confident himself, like it or not, and he's so confident, and I work in the corporate world a lot now, like he has these 4 principles that, first principles of who he is, and he was able to go into communities that previous Republican parties would have not spent time in. He went to the Bronx, he would go into the Black community, he would go to college students, he would talk to Hispanics, he would go anywhere and everywhere possible. And the groups of people that supported him also did, and you were able to chip away the numbers. I remember when I was younger, I worked on the Bush campaign. I remember Karl Rove I was working in Florida. I'm a Miami-Dade resident, and for reference, like I'm half Cuban, half Mexican. I've worked all across the country. And I remember the strategy back then was lose by less. Was
For the Republicans.
For the Republicans.
2004, Carrie, it's exactly what you did to it.
So we knew we weren't going to win Miami-Dade County. It was bastion of Democrats, but the strategy was lose by less. Fast forward, I was working on the Rick Scott campaign. Susie Wiles was our campaign manager. She also had that strategy. We're going to pull these counties where we know we have a lot of support, that usually people ignore them because they just assume they're going to go vote on them, and we're going to increase turnout to the highest % possible. And then we're going to lose by less in Miami-Dade County. What happened this? Now we did that nationally. She did that nationally. She had an incredible campaign. So we lost by less in all these communities. Trump won, increased his margins in every county in the country. He won with every group except 2. White, educated, college-educated women, mostly unmarried, because he did win married women, and over 65.
You had to over 65.
Yeah, this is who Harris won with.
Good.
Harris did better with white, educated women, but
Young women.
particularly,
And then older women.
no,
No.
in general, like, but,
Across the board,
but in
Got it,
general,
got it.
but really well with unmarried women. Trump won married women. And over 65. Every other group in the country moved a little. I'm not saying he won them, but he did better with them because it didn't come from a position of identity politics. It didn't come from a position of, because you are XYZ, I'm assuming that you're going to vote for me.
Mhm.
He went and like, let's talk about the issues that connect us. So let's talk about the economy. My dad was a factory worker and a school bus driver. My mom was a social worker. The economy is a huge issue because we came to this country for the American dream, much like Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans and all these groups and everyone. And most Americans in the United States are working class Americans. 75%, I think, Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Things are not lovely right now.
Mhm.
And when you have to ask the cashier at CVS to open the plastic to get a deodorant, like, don't tell me the economy is doing great. Like, I see it with my own two eyes. And I think that what happened in this election is that some Americans felt like they were being gaslit a little bit by the Harris Biden economy. Like, no, the economy is great. Jobs are better than ever. I'm like, well, in 2019, going to McDonald's, I could get a sandwich for $1.50. Today, that sandwich is $3.50. And for a lot of Americans, they rely on fast food to get their food because life is busy. And I think the other thing I do feel that Trump had a mandate, and because that's referent not only his numbers on how the entire country moved in that direction and assuring the House and the Senate I think it was a rejection of the left. Too many of us on the right feel that those on the left love to lecture, but do not listen. And from a personal example, I'll tell you the word Latinx. I hate the word Latinx more than anything on the entire planet. No one in my community created the word Latinx. Someone decided that we are going to decide how you should identify, and I'm going to use that word for you. It's a perfect example of what's happened in the last 4 years. Using that word is just a bigger picture of a feeling that you are constantly lectured to. And if you do not agree with that terminology, you are judged and used really harsh rhetoric. You were a racist or a fascist or a Nazi or things like, and instead of having a conversation, like, why don't we like that word? What other word? Can we use another word for it? It was no, it's my way or the highway. And that's how a lot of people felt. And it was so there are a lot of things that play this election, but it was the economy. It was some core issues. It was Trump organizing a really diverse assembly of people coalesced on issues. Tulsi Gabbard and Kennedy joined him for their own kind of thing, but it was some of it called the Avengers, right? and Elon Musk, like, it was a different kind of group of people. And then this rejection of what they felt was censorship and being lectured to for the last 4 years and not being able to live this American dream that's not only about prosperity, but it's also this basic free speech and talking and not feeling judged every second of every day.
So Elise, you're the number cruncher as Kiki. Well, you have to look at all of that. So if you,
caveats with, I think, all the numbers thrown
that's good.
out today,
Start with the caveat.
they're still evolving in several camps, so.
Okay. But when you look at that, to some of Kiki's points too, did the gaps hold up? Did they not? Did they shrink? Or do we not know yet? As you say, things are still swirling a bit.
Well, the gender gap was what was so vaunted pre-election. And then when it came down to it at the end of the day, it wasn't really that big and it wasn't even that different. Kamala Harris actually had less support by 2 points than Joe Biden did in 2020. She had 53%, Trump had 46%. So he actually improved himself from his 2020 performance. Where I see a gap that's worth noting is among many of you who sit in this room, 18 to 29. And the younger voters have always fascinated me. I go around the country and do a lot of focus groups, some for MSNBC, but some for nonprofits. And I guess they're not millennials. I can't call y'all millennials now. You're younger than that, but young people are always the most well-informed voters, and they're getting their news usually from credible organizations. They are so on top of the issues, and they aren't yet really polarized and jaded and cynical the way that some of your other groups of voters might be. But then this year, something happened. Certainly the youth vote, any campaign that says that they're going to win off the youth vote, you know that they're going to lose probably if they're really counting on that, because never turns out.
Second cut at all of you.
Sorry, but this year it did seem like it was a year that maybe youth voters would be more activated just because of some of the issue sets. Young men were, and that was the big difference, the gender gap with young men. And that was part of an overall Trump strategy that was very male dominated. You could say it was even chauvinist, appealing to men. That was the Joe Rogan. It was going on podcasts that are geared towards younger audiences. And it worked for the first time, really separating young people from the Democratic Party. And that surprised me that he was able to significantly alter what has, just been kind of a longstanding tenet that young people tend to be more liberal. But then I was thinking this past week and kind of just dissecting everything that happened. And back in June, I was in Wisconsin for some focus groups, and I didn't do any actually with just young men. I did a lot of young women because we wanted to talk to them about how they were talking about the issues with their families and with their fathers and what was important to these young women. And if Joe Biden was still in the race, and no one was going to turn out for him. They were very uninspired to vote, and just why would I bother? This is, a dinosaur to me. They're trying to put in an 86-year-old. It was just a level of unenthusiasm that I have never seen before. And then a month later, when Kamala got in, there was enthusiasm in the Democratic Party that was Obama-like, Trump-like. It was less about her than just that they had some hope now that Joe Biden, relief, exactly. And so, but I think back to those young women and how they kind of foretold that even they didn't have an agenda that they necessarily were going after, and they were disillusioned with what the powers to be had done. And so you look at where Trump was really able to make success, young men, men in general, Hispanic men, and those were specific goals that Trump's top pollster laid out. He said, Republicans can make inroads with Hispanic men, with Hispanic voters. They tend to be more evangelical. There are plenty of votes to be picked off there. And then you look at what's happened over the last, I guess 8 years since Me Too, and how many voters were paid attention to in, slice and dice certain sectors of the electorate. Men were not until Trump. And what is it? And there's a lot of resentment that has been stoked and fermenting. And, there was kind of this bro moment of, some people would call it toxic masculinity, but then coupled with you got your women who are still hanging around, that's your formula for winning an election. So I would say that 18 to 29, fascinated with your demo and how it's going to mature and continue. But then it really came down to a better campaign. A better campaign at the end of the day that really, Kamala didn't have a prayer, frankly. I think that she came in with such a losing hand, and I would be even more blunt and dismal. Biden was going to lose by double digits. It was going to be heinous if he had stayed in the race. The way that voters separate from the political elite class were speaking about Joe Biden, and that lingering baggage along with the economy takes separately, but there was just this moment of distrust, and they felt like the Democratic Party couldn't be trusted. This was a lot of young people, but I'm talking about plenty of Trump voters that I spoke to. So I think that overall Trump being crazy didn't matter up against what they saw as dishonesty and uncertainty too, because Kamala Harris didn't have a long time to establish herself with voters. Undecided voters wanted specifics. You kept hearing that over and over during the 140 days. But looking back, I don't think that some of those undecided voters were that undecided. I think they were always going to go Trump at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is always the problem with
Yeah.
polling.
One thing you said, and because no one actually looks to me for the numbers, I could get away with this, but I would say in the late summer, after the vice president stepped up to fill the gap, and Jody, to your point about the enthusiasm and what that portends, is I would look at people and I'd say, we're in a 50-50 race. And there was a window where we were in a 50-50 race. And 2 months before that, we'd been in an 80-20 race. Now, that's an exaggeration of the numbers were, but I think Elise would tell us it's not that big an exaggeration because once you found your floor, there is no floor, it could have come to that. And so this is a case where I've been professionally active through 9 presidential cycles, which I probably shouldn't promote. And I have to say, the vice president in her 100+ days as a presidential candidate this cycle performed with more discipline than I've ever seen of a winning or a losing candidate in a general or a primary. And so you're hearing a theme from both Republicans and Democrats on these panels. How much of it was her versus, to Bettina's point, there's been a long conversation that's either happened or not happened, right? That she had to manage the residual effect.
Yeah, and damage is collateral damage is.
Well, but also, she also there are arguments that she benefited from the short window. What would it have been? You know, there are pros and cons to it had she gone through a primary. As a general rule, we all like primaries because we think primaries make candidates stronger. It makes anybody better at what you do when you get to practice it a lot. By the same token, would a year of defending Joe Biden's record, which, by the way, I happen to think he's a great American patriot, the way he stayed in that 3rd week so he could get hostages out. I want to go on the record with that he took all the heat so he could continue those negotiations. And so all of a sudden you begin to look at the if this, then that, and you begin to realize, I'm not sure she could have, under any circumstances, gotten there in a 100-day campaign under these circumstances. But it was a better shot than we had.
Well, and to differ a little bit with Patrick, what his numbers saying, like this wasn't a landslide.
That was.
Yeah, it was, because you look at
Not in the popular vote, but it was an electoral landslide.
in the states that matter, and then in
All
districts
7
where
swing states.
she underperformed, and then Trump went back. He managed to, I know it was over in Georgia when those rural counties, he built it up again. And she wasn't getting to where Biden got in 2020. And then big picture, so I'm saying 18, I'm watching 18 to 29.
You heard it
and
here
then-
first.
And then class. It's not really along gender or race.
It
It's
was
about
income.
class, the college educated and non-college educated.
And if you want to look at another set of numbers as things evolve, go look at the New Hampshire governor's race, right? Democratic governors, we won in North Carolina. We won in Washington State, where Republicans should have made an early play. They might have had a shot. So New Hampshire is famous for split ticket voting, right? Harris won, but didn't perform at the level to get it. And that governor's race was intractable, almost the way the presidential campaign was, right up until the end. 50-50 with the Democrat performing just under when you'd be in there. And then all of a sudden you saw the race break to about 9 points, right? And it's an interesting state to look at in terms of a high number of women voters, 2 women candidates, a state with 2 women elected. I mean, right? All white, by the way, all white women. But it's an interesting place to look at the numbers and take that microcosm of New Hampshire up against the rest of the country.
Sorry, just to add another thing, it's like reinforce. I do believe this is a mandate. You're going to hear this a lot in the next few months of the mandate. But that is
everyone.
Mandates can be deadly.
Okay, fine. Anyway,
No,
second of all, it's like the numbers that he moved in some states, I would not be surprised New Jersey, New York become
Miami-Dade County.
Well, Florida now is a red state.
Yeah, but even
We got 2
Miami.
governor's races up next year in the states.
And you look at counties, this is not just about men. This is to the other point. This is about the majority of America and how they feel that their issues, that it's not about identity, it's about issues and the feeling that for too many years, people have not listened to them. You have places like Starr County in Texas that for 120 years went Democrat, went Republican. You have counties in New Jersey and Philadelphia. You have wards in Chicago that went Republican. This is not like a flash in the pan kind of thing. This was an entire movement across the country. And okay, it wasn't 75%, but for modern day American politics, it was a huge, huge thing. And to pretend that these voters, they just have to be more educated, or there was misinformation. It is so, insulting.
That feeds to the condescending, that feeds
Well,
into
and
the
a lot of,
condescending
and a lot of
narrative that
TV, I
they're-
remember would be
Yeah.
saying, the uneducated voters, oh my
No,
God.
that's bad.
Super condescending, like my uncle, an immigrant to this country, spoke 8 languages, but because he had to flee his country, did not have more than a high school degree. He was not uneducated, he just didn't have a diploma. And pretending that those people are dumb because they didn't get a 4-year degree is how the Democrats got here.
So let me, but you raise a good point, Bettina. I just want to segue to this too. So again, dangerous territory. The previous panel went there too. Is this, are we seeing a realignment? Has a realignment been underway actually since 2016 or before? Look at Mike before, and that's why I want your views on, right?
Before, wouldn't you?
And so,
Before, but-
political scientists love this phrase realignment because it sounds like maybe something would move in an interesting way they can study. They've been waiting since FDR, for the next great big realignment. But this, this could at least be qualified as a contender. Watch this spot. So do you think that, can we use the R word yet, or should we modify it? Or
I'm gonna say-
realignment?
I'm gonna say it.
Realignment.
It's kind of an old-fashioned term, I think, in political science.
It is,
But I'm gonna say I think it is.
okay?
I think it is because I think the way in which, realigning elections are not only about sort of the new coalition that's formed that sort of endures, but it's also the collapse of the old coalition. And I think in many ways, this was the collapse of the 2008 Obama coalition, which was a sort of a patchwork on the sort of collapse of the New Deal coalition. And so I think that the Democrats have been in this sort of constant crisis. And I think that in many ways the other thing we think about in political science, old-fashioned term, is this idea of the median voter. And so I think in many ways, the Democratic Party's median voter kind of shifted probably a little too left. And then the vote Democratic tent kind of got a little bit too narrow.
So now,
And so I think in many ways, the Republicans were able to kind of keep their median voter where it was, which is far more conservative than earlier Republicans, but they were able to broaden that tent. And so then it becomes realigning election when those institutional things happen, right? If Republicans take both the House and the Senate, then they start enacting different policies, and then those policies create new politics, right? And the new politics are what the realignment is.
I would posit truly a theory and ask somebody like Kim, who is an expert in the history of it. I would look up and I would say a realignment by Bill Clinton of the party's place in 92, a recapture of the Reagan Democrats that we had lost through the 60s. We lost after Johnson, right? And then I would look up and I would say, Obama comes in, and this is why I say mandates are dangerous. It's just a different point of view.
they might,
If
they
I
might
were
happen, but they're
advising,
dangerous.
if I were advising Susie Wiles or Chris LaCivita, I would say, go and watch what happened with Obama. Be careful about what you define as a mandate and how far you carry it, because, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little on the panel tomorrow, is he has a new coalition to govern with.
Right.
And that's a big warning sign there. So the question becomes realignment now, and I would go back and ask everyone to go look at what Newt Gingrich determined in 1993 would drive that realignment. He wrote a 14-year plan. It was designed to be 12 to 14 years, first go into the legislature and create the agenda, right? So yeah, realignment.
This could be it, right? In one sense too, it's been 12 years of Trump, I mean, he has defined an era in a way, if you consider since 2016 to now as well, even out of office. He was omnipresent.
A young woman in a Zoom call I was in recently, last week, say, she's 29, I think, and she said, this man has dominated my 20s.
That's it. That's it. Exactly.
Would you say the Obama Biden did as well?
No, but I'm saying she was 29, so it's the span of when Trump has been. She was talking about her experience, that he's been the
As a
dominant
voter,
political
she's
figure in
only
her
had, right.
20s.
He's been a dominant
She
figure
wasn't
on
talking
the
about the
landscape.
agenda, I mean,
Bettina,
just him
right?
as a political,
Even when he was out of office.
Well, I just thought it was really interesting,
which speaks to
you know,
his
when
influence.
they sort of trot Obama out to basically scold young black men.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that really was that moment where I was like, oh, this is actually not going to work.
That's an interesting point. You can look back on those moments almost
Lecturing.
cinematically to say, if he had to be giving that lecture.
Yeah,
No one likes to be lectured.
right.
Yeah,
And I think it
yeah.
feeds into this narrative of the sort of condescension,
Yeah.
right? That, these are I mean, Dave Oxford said this, Democrats are sort of these social workers, these missionaries, and they're sort of scolding people. But also, I think in many ways, this idea that, Harris and Clinton, they have a plan, right? But it's like, it's a plan that I have to like apply to a program and get sort of evaluated. No one wants to do that.
Yeah.
No one wants to feel like they're a client.
Back to small government serves you more directly, right? Right. I want to talk about the college gap just quickly and then open it up for questions. But actually, Jennifer, my colleague who's in the audience, works at UCLA. And I worked at NYU for many years, and Alicia's here. Alicia worked at NYU. The discussion was, for instance, for Biden and his folks, did they ever really get it right and the message about forgiving student loans, which clearly they were trying to use as a lever early on, but both it got complicated because they couldn't get Congress to pass.
Working class voters love that. I'm
That
kidding. I
some,
am very
but
kidding about that.
they hate it,
Yeah,
exactly.
I
And that's
hate it.
exactly what we said at breakfast. Thank you for reinforcing it. He couldn't get it done. The way he had to get it done through such a cut and piece and fabric way made it very hard to message. And then there were a lot of people out in the country going, pass that by me again,
Yeah.
right? I'm going to forgive student loans for people who got to go to college, and I'm sitting here with diminished
A lot of
prospects.
people like, not to put it on myself, but like, I want to go away to school. My family couldn't afford it. I was very lucky to be from Florida, and we had a program for people that did well academically, and that had a full academic scholarship. I made that financial decision for myself. Other people make different financial decisions for themselves, but that was not an option for me. And there's millions of working class Americans that felt insulted, like that. Why are you doing that? What about me?
Exactly. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
That's one issue example hitting a demographic in a certain way.
The real lesson in this is if you go to the economic argument for why you do it, there's a lot to be said why you do it that's not about the student, right? In the macro, it releases a lot of money back into the economy for home ownership. The political flaw is that if you have to explain that policy,
That's it.
you're not going to win,
What's that?
right? And by the way, the people who benefit from the forgiveness structure right now were not the 19 to 29-year-olds, because, in order to meet the threshold to
You
do
were already
it,
10
you had to
years.
have already paid the equivalent of the base of your loan. This was not a total freebie, right? But the fact that I'm sitting here explaining it
Right,
is the failure of the political decision, right?
It's famous, like if you're explaining.
You're losing, exactly.
Trotting out the student loan debt relief as a huge accomplishment for the
For
working
good.
class.
This
That
woman is
is
tone deaf.
Again,
Bidenomics, where
No.
people believed that that was even a thing.
no.
Record inflation and
Okay, don't get on the first day. Come on.
No, it's
by 9 points, and we're supposed to believe that the economy's good, and they're selling us, they have to sell us that the economy is good. And so that is another example of just how Democrats lost touch
Yeah.
with
Yeah,
the working
but-
class.
But one thing to not lose touch within this, and this is, again, the argument of the mandate, is the Senate races we thought we would lose, we lost. Casey, maybe an exception. So again, if you're going into this White House and you're the political director, you have to look up and go, yeah, carried Arizona, couldn't get her across the line. Oh, got in it, couldn't swipe out Michigan. I mean, so when you look at the states, and then the panelists will laugh at me. I want to remind you, next year we have 2 off-year gubernatorial elections in states where he made inroads in, New Jersey and Virginia. Pay attention, because the quality of candidates in those states for Democrats is very high, but it's a much tougher road now than it was.
Yeah,
We thought
yeah,
it was 2 weeks
interesting,
ago. It was
right.
always tough. And then in 26, it is, forget the House and the Senate, like I'm done with that. The governor's races.
she's a states girl.
I mean, really, right? Like, we're not going to elect a senator or president. So, but in 26, all of those states have gubernatorial races up, and the biggest stars from both parties are up or have open seats. Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania, up for re-election, right? Gretchen Whitmer can't run again. Tony Evers can't run again, right? Katie Hobbs, Arizona, up for real. So you watch, these are really challenging 2 years for a guy who just had a really good win as president.
Right, and the board he's facing.
And those gaps are more present in those
In those
statewide
states.
races.
So let's
set it
turn for
quicker
some
that way.
questions. We have some hands up, and Tom will get you the mic. Go ahead.
Hi there, I'm Chris Birkin. I'm a lecturer in journalism at City St George's University in London. I just wondered what the panel thinks of the much vaunted and very expensive, what the future is for the much vaunted and very expensive democratic ground game, which hasn't really delivered a presidential victory since the Obama era. And clearly Trump, who outsourced his ground game, as I understand it, felt it wasn't necessary and found other networks and routes into getting that sort of new mail vote that you talked about earlier. Do you think that the ground game, as we understand it, has any future at all?
I think that the world has changed, so ground games have changed. So what I spent my college years and 20s knocking on doors is it's just a different world. There's digital, there's new resources, there are new things. If you look at, my experience, you can all talk about the Obama, but what happened on this election, from talking to lots of friends, like there was still a big emphasis on mail. There's a huge emphasis on mail. There was
MAIL.
Oh, got it. Took me a
Postal,
second.
there's a big emphasis on postal.
There's a snail mail. Things for certain people. There was a big emphasis on alternative, big digital. The Trump campaign was really smart on marketing and digital, to use that to connect with people using phones, using email. There was a big emphasis also on, with outside groups, of new ways of connecting, like Charlie Cook and Trending Put USA had this amazing ground game in colleges all across the country, engaging with people with events at 5,000 people talking about the issues. Like, it is a new ball game. And at least I can only talk for the Republican Party, some of those things happened, but there was a lot of new ways to do it. And you had other groups like the Libre Initiative, which was created several years ago, who, when I was working on the Romney campaign, I was really excited that we opened like new campaign offices in Nevada and parts of Florida. That continued during the RNC, and they opened 16 field offices. But then you have organizations like the Libre Initiative opening offices all across the country. And it's sometimes the first line of defense to talking to these communities about issues, not identity politics, about like, here's the economy, this, and let me talk to you about all these, different practical issues to educate them about American conservative principles.
So, but maybe what you're asking, I think, is the traditional ground game, canvassers, ding dong, and they
I
did
can say
value
one
it.
thing that's not good, that maybe they'll abandon next cycle, busing in New Yorkers to go canvass in Pennsylvania. And the Pennsylvania residents are complaining that they just have gotten their door knocked on so many times, they're just done with it.
I'm not prepared to evaluate either way until we really understand where the voter turnout dropped off. I'm not defending the ground game. I'm a comms girl. I'll put an ad up any day. But my husband, who's a campaign manager by trade, is furious when I say straight that. But until we understand the voter drop off, and we had new participants in early vote, right? Well, look, one of the things I think we have to do as a country is we have to come up, fairness is bullshit, all right? Equity is what you want. So we have to make voting accessible to everyone, easy to do. I think you've seen President and now President-elect Trump turn his tune a little bit on that, because it worked for him this year.
Early voting.
And mail. He got behind mail this year. And so, AIL. Mail AIL. And so I'm not prepared to say Bettina's correct. A ground game is different now. The question is, what kind of ground game and how is that, and when and how to use it? And so until we have those final numbers of like who showed where, and we haven't studied the numbers on why the people who didn't vote, because they didn't participate in an exit poll. So we don't know why they didn't come yet. She's got to go do some work and find out why they didn't go.
Right, the competition for the couch, they called it at some point. People would just lay about and never came out to vote. Another question?
They made a decision.
Over here? Anyone else? They'll get up.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. This is more of a question for Bettina. So Kimberly mentioned the 3I, inflation, identity, and immigration. I'm not going to pretend that I resonate with people who live paycheck by paycheck, and I don't think a lot of us can. We are in Oxford after all. But I do wanted to talk about identity and immigration within racial minority groups, especially Latino groups. I feel like there's a underestimation of the level of misogyny, transphobia, as well as homophobia within whether, African American groups, Asian American groups, or Latino groups. And there's this idea of machismo, and, that sort of is a big factor. And as well as this whole idea of, even though we are immigrants, we're not going to close the door behind us because we've come here now, and we're not going to support illegal immigrants anymore. So the question for Bettina is that since the demographic is rapidly changing and we see Latino groups sort of becoming the dominant, I guess, population group within the next several years, where do you think that's going to go? Like, where do you think the identity within the Latino group is going to go, and where do you think the immigration policy in order to, I guess, resonate with them is going to go?
Okay. That's a lot.
Break that down. You got it.
A few things. Number one, the Latino identity is really complicated, and I have talked a lot that there's no such thing as a Latino vote. There are communities that have Latinos. Like I joke around, I think last time, that I'm half Cuban, half Mexican, and the only thing my parents have in common is like me and my brother. The Spanish is different, the food is different, everything is different, and the campaigns for that is different. That being said, on immigration, the Latino community has changed a lot. Most Hispanics are US born, they're English dominant. It's a different community. Immigration is still important, but I think that you have to put it in the context of what has happened in the last few years. Under the Trump administration, you had about 3 million encounters at the border. Over the last 4 years, you're talking about 10 million. That is a lot. And then you talk about also how those affects these communities. A lot of that, drug cartels have really maximized that. These people to come in the drug cartels have used it to move people, and they've made billions off of that. So they're being charged between 10,000 to 100,000 for each people. Talk about 10 people, that's $1 million the drug cartels are doing it. And that's not improving communities, that's making communities less safe. As far as voting patterns, a lot of Latinos who voted for Trump, how they felt was they feel the pressure of this mass immigration that has changed their communities. We all know the Latino communities, like Latino immigrants or all immigrants, are less likely to commit crime. But just by numbers alone, where there's so many more people, there has been more crime. And in the news, there's been a lot of these stories that have created fear. And I'll say from my own communities that for my family, even there is a lot of pressure. So a lot of these Latino immigrants who voted, it was not about misogyny or any of that stuff. It is about the economy has gotten worse. It is hard for them to live. The American dream is more difficult, and it is complicated. But some of them is, I think you mentioned it, or maybe someone mentioned it. You see these communities where there's immigrants who have come in undocumented or illegally, who are getting free housing, who are getting paycheck, and they can't figure out how to put gas in their car. That creates some tension. They also feel that they are not the ones that are being targeted. When Trump talks about the people committing the crimes, they don't think that's them. They think that, yes, we as a country need to secure our border. We do need to know who's in it. And if we could do something to take away the worst of them, that is good. And the reality is there's a lot of people that would say that Venezuela and Maduro have sent the worst of the worst up here. In Miami, as growing up in the 80s and 90s as a kid, that's what Fidel did. Fidel opened up the prisons and said, hey, you want immigrants? I'll send you immigrants. And he opened up the jails and all these things and sent them. And Miami had a really bad crime problem for a really long time. So there's not one answer to that very complicated question, but I will say is, if you look at the statistics, for the first time, most Americans believe that, I would say first time, but many Americans believe that we have to do something on immigration. They are supportive of deporting the worst, like the people committing heinous crimes. And they do feel that there has to be something because there has been such a major influx, and that is complicated for what Kimberly said before on lots of different issues.
On lots of different states. I think the Vice Chancellor of Oxford has a question.
I wanted to ask a college-related question. We've heard a lot about the college education gap and the role it played, but this was the first election that I can remember where colleges were directly in the spotlight. And I think particularly the parade of university presidents in front of the Virginia Fox Congressional Committee. And my question is, was that a significant factor in the lead up to the election? Is it a new normal? University leaders in the UK are very familiar with being in the spotlight, being a political football between the two major parties. But in the US, is this something that my successor needs to get used to?
Well, first of all, big picture, there is no more perfectly divisive issue than Israel-Gaza. And on both sides, Democrats were hugely divided, and there was no middle road that Kamala or Joe Biden could even adopt, but they didn't adopt a middle road. And that really frustrated the voters in Michigan. What were they? They called themselves undeclared or
The undeclared.
the undeclared voters. And then you look at what happened in Dearborn, and it kind of shows, and Muslim American voters were actually blocked that Bush won in 2004 and tend to be more conservative. And you look at exit polls, one interview, a Muslim voter said, "How could it be any worse? I'm just going to go with Trump this go round." And I do think that the campus protest hugely contributed to the cultural unease and unrest. And so one of the arguments against Trump was he brought in more chaos, but then voters see chaos on college campuses that they see as they see it just unconstrained. And so it contributed to just the general feeling of identity politics, wokeness. It's all out of control. What can we do to get some order? And then you've got your law and order candidate.
It's interesting. I'm in the middle of reading Doris Kearns Goodwin's new book that she released this summer that she wrote, going back through the archives with her husband, Dick Goodwin, who was famously a speechwriter and a young aide to JFK, and then to Johnson, and then to Bobby Kennedy, and then to Johnson. And it's a fascinating review of their boxes of their own diaries as young staffers. And you go back through those LBJ eras, and I am a South Texan by birth, so the fact that if I had been a boy, I probably would have been named Lyndon. And so there was a real risk. To revisit, if you actually take a minute, there are some historic moments that you can look up and learn lessons from, right? Where was LBJ? Where was this moment? And by the way, the impact that you raise on the college presidents, and that sets up the debate, who's against you and who's with you and who's against you. All of a sudden there is an elite battle, and you have a target for it. But by the way, that has been not just with the working class voter or who became the Trump voter, but it's also the progressive students on campus. That was a double whammy that you don't see very often, right? Where if you really think about politics in its extreme form, politics is not a line, it's a circle. And the people on the farthest end, and you can define what the circle is about. Anger over Gaza, you can define it, and pick your issue, that the two on the outermost will always meet on the backside, and you can build a coalition there, right? And that's where you can decrease gaps. So.
Yeah, I mean,
So what should the next university president do, Kiki, to bring those together?
They should be talking to their students a lot. The campuses, I'm not an academician, I haven't run a university, but my experience is you saw campuses where there was high levels of dialogue with the constituencies early on in the game, with students who had parents and adults in their lives that were helping them be there, with the community where they were located. I mean, right?
I mean, I would just say, like, being at NYU, good to see you again, and then looking at what was happening uptown at Columbia. I mean, Columbia is sort of like the worst case scenario. And I think that like you said, one of the things is that these events really highlighted the notion of this out of touch elite. The fact that when testifying, presidents couldn't sort of waffle. They tried to waffle on whether or not this or that
They
was
only
answered.
listen to the lawyers.
Right, and they came up as just wholly
desperate to
unconvincing.
go to that brief.
Throw the
Right.
lawyers out the room.
Right.
Right, we all looked in and were like,
Right.
please let us brief them and prep. That was a disaster.
Right. So I think that, I think that they were out of touch. And then I think particularly for the Harvard president, the issue of DEI came up, right? And that suddenly oh, wait a minute, this is someone who was kind of groomed from the ranks and didn't quite seem to have. And this is all very inside baseball-ish, but I think it did come to this perception that the university leadership was wholly out of touch,
Yeah.
perhaps not even.
But actually, it touched not only with the American public, but with their own
Right.
campuses. I think that was, interestingly, the one common thread with the infamous hearing with the three women brought up. The other thing they all shared was they were very new.
Right.
They had just been appointed, and in any profession, any position, they didn't have the benefit of knowing when to throw the
Getting beat up
lawyers
a
out of
few
the
times.
room.
Experience.
So experience counts.
That raises something that we haven't talked about yet.
Absolutely.
For Elise. Where are the Christian evangelical voters?
This may be the first political panel I've been on. I know, but I mean, they've not been a topic today. Or
But I think it's part of the core, and I would say, Catholics went for Trump. The
Totally.
last time they went for Biden. I think we don't talk about it because I don't think anyone was surprised.
They're the
Um,
basin
yeah,
they've won.
yeah,
So
I
They
think they
won on
won.
the basin they've won on
Yeah.
abortion, which is their number one animated issue.
So they can pull back.
Continues in some.
But what
Yeah.
happens in the, what happens when
Exactly.
they look up and they say on these referendums that they lost?
And then they see the ripple effect of how Roe's reversal can really politically hurt them and
Right.
politically toxic.
Yeah.
But
Right.
this election,
And
it
what do they do
wasn't,
next?
there was also such an overinvestment in abortion as a top animating issue by the Harris campaign. And it was, but among a certain subset of
Small.
elite women voters who had the luxury of getting to be concerned with women's health care. And I certainly think this is first and foremost, but you can see where isolating it as an issue, and because the various lobbies that have been involved in this politically contentious issue, making it into pro-choice versus basic women's health care and the right to health care as a woman, the issue was so muddy that they weren't really able to capitalize the way that they should have.
Even though they thought they were probably widening then their ability to appeal.
Well, it did
Right.
work in 22,
Yeah.
right?
It did
Again, the
work.
down ballot races,
Right.
it performed. Presidential,
And
not
there
so
are,
much,
you know,
right?
some theories out there that actually the Democrats profoundly misread the 22 midterm elections, which seemed like, oh, maybe not so bad. You know, we can go out again because we did so well in so many of those races.
Higher turnout.
Higher turnout. And that's exactly what I was going to come around again. But the difference was they misread, that was a high turnout election. And that made a difference, to Kiki's point, to the results at the end too. This turned out not, maybe surprisingly, to be high turnout. It was low performance. So that, you know, dynamic didn't hold up the way it did in 22. And it's, you know, Kiki knows this very well, Bettina too. You get clues, you get signals, but for a campaign person or for a person running a cause, it's what to make of those signals. And what's the scenario, what's the plan B if I've misread the turnout? Do we have any other questions? Oh, yep. Okay.
Hello, my name is Beatrix and I'm a freshman at NYU. And I am a little worried because I have noticed, I'm 18 by the way, so this is my first, election. I noticed with my friends from my hometown, but also as well my peers here, that people my age they didn't seem interested in voting. And I felt like for such an important election, it was really just weird that people my age, they weren't interested. There's a range of reasons. I heard some people say it's difficult to get an absentee ballot, or they just didn't understand the process. And I also heard my state is red or my state is blue, so it doesn't matter if I vote. So they didn't want to vote. And I was just wondering, like, how do you think the government and our country is going to deal with this in the
They're going
future?
to ignore you more and more. I'll be very blunt. This is what Kiki was saying. If you don't vote, and if your age group doesn't vote or your demographic, they all look at that and they say, well, we're not going to put our attention and resources there. We're going to look for the groups. That's a harsh comment, but I think I'd throw it back to you. What are you going to do about it? All right. I mean, how involved do you get to say, come on, guys, we can figure out a system to, now a lot of it's electronic. You know, you can just go on and register to vote. You can get your absentee ballot, it depends state by state. And it's not the easiest process in the US for sure. But I think that's more a question for you all to convene and say, what are you going to do about it? Because it's a problem. This is what Lisa's saying too. That's why she's watching your age group. I think in front of
There was a bit of a mention from Bettina about sort of the digital media landscape and the incredible, quite frankly, job that the Trump campaign did in terms of getting on those podcasts, getting out there. I mean, I think I've heard more of my British friends listening to the Joe Rogan Trump episode than like I've ever heard anyone listening to a podcast. What, and I guess this is for everyone, but what are Democrats doing wrong digitally? What has gone wrong? Or is the digital media landscape sort of a fluke thing that Democrats should not sort of pour their attention and money into in the next campaign cycle?
Look, I would tell you, and nobody's going to accuse me of being a digital expert in the era of the digital, but I would tell you that the Harris campaign was on par digitally. We can debate about whether she did Joe Rogan or not. She was doing other podcasts. I think maybe Elise would tell us that it wasn't about whether or not they were a successful digital team. It was about what I've heard today is it was a message. So we were conveying a message that was unpopular. She had as sophisticated a digital operation as Trump did. It was a message versus the vehicle.
yeah.
Well, and the complaint among Republicans when they're looking at the Democrats is it's ad by algorithm. Certainly not true for Steve McMahon's ads.
Which are bespoke.
But what, who can remember an ad from this last cycle? What was the ad? Just think. A single ad, a digital ad, a television.
I can say the bad ones. I remember like the man ad that they had. Oh, God.
From Alabama.
Carburetor.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah,
who
yeah.
has a carburetor? But I can remember all the bad ads.
I can tell you, I can remember sitting in a sports bar in Manhattan in my Longhorn t-shirt to watch the Longhorns get beat by Georgia. And it was also in the middle of the Yankees, Yankees World Series run. And it was probably the first time, and I feel confident both were national buys, probably the first time there'd been a national media buy since before 92, because in 92 was the first time we bought by statewide on Clinton, and they were not national buys. And both of the horrifically vicious transgender ads, one came up on the channel with the Longhorn gang, calling out, all read by name, calling him a child predator, literally that bad. And then on the networks that had the Yankees game, which was a national broadcast as well, but aimed nationally, was the anti-transgender ad by the Trump campaign. And I remember sitting there because it was like in the middle of 23 screens. So it was like really like, wow, my Longhorns are getting beaten, and I'm watching some of those. And I'm a hard ass. I believe in a good attack ad. It was some of the most vicious advertising I'd ever seen.
But people remembered that ad.
They sure do.
Kamala Harris is for them.
And it was a fear-based ad driving right down the middle.
And then the complaint on
but
the
ever
ground in
since the girl with the
Wisconsin.
Daisy and the Goldwater campaign. I
yeah,
mean,
the
this
endorsement's
is
good.
not a clean, yeah,
Refresh on
this
that,
really
right?
dates me. But this was 64 Goldwater, Wisconsin, and it was a famous ad. Remember, they were still under the shadow of the Cold War and atomic, and they took it off, right? Because it created such a backlash.
They'd already done what they needed.
So it was
Because there were only 3 networks.
I'll explain
Let
the
me hear
ad.
about it.
It's just pretty hard hitting. So yes, but I always say in American history and politics, you know, we've had a lot of rough campaigns over the years, and there's a lot of scoundrels and scalawags out there. So every time you say it's the worst ever, it probably has not been the worst ever. Now, on that edifying note, I have to end the session. Can you think of something to rise me up from that comment? Kimberly's,
I think.
sing us out, would
Well,
you?
I mean, as a political scientist, this is an intellectually exciting moment. Lots
There
of
you
great
go.
articles.
The happy
and good
person.
books.
That's right.
Lots of interesting sort of long-standing puzzles. So I mean, intellectually, it's, I think, very
It'll keep you
interesting.
busy.
It'll keep us very busy. I think that, American politics is a politics of cycles. We go through areas of heightened polarization and less polarization. So it's nothing new.
That's my point.
I'm going to remain bullish on American democracy. I don't think
Our elections worked.
that,
Our
our elections work.
Democracy is strong. Yes.
And I think that, it'll be interesting, but I'm not going to sort of give up on the notion that,
Nor studying it.
or not studying for publishing.
Yeah, so publishing. Thank you for that more uplifting end to the panel. Thank you, Kimberly.